Chapter 10. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith emerged from the room of caged animals, shaken and bruised. The bats had left deep cuts on their skin, and the sound of their screeching still echoed in their ears. They stumbled down the hallway, holding on to each other for support. But as they rounded a corner, they froze. Before them stood a figure of pure darkness. It towered over them, its eyes glowing with malevolent energy. Jamie could feel its power seeping into him, making him weak and vulnerable. Elena and Lilith seemed equally frightened, their eyes widening in terror. The figure spoke, its voice a deep, echoing growl. "You dare to trespass in my domain," it said. "You are not but insignificant insects to be crushed beneath my might." Jamie tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse. "We didn't mean to," he managed to stammer out. But the figure paid him no heed. It stepped forward, and the three of them gasped as it passed through them like smoke. They stumbled back, dizzy and disoriented. As they regained their senses, they realized that the figure had vanished, but its power lingered, like a black cloud that threatened to consume them. Jamie felt a wave of despair wash over him, leaving him trembling and weak. Elena and Lilith clung to him, whispering words of encouragement. But Jamie knew they were all in grave danger. The power of darkness had shown itself, and it was not to be trifled with. Chapter 11. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith stumbled through the dark corridors, their bodies aching from the wounds inflicted by the bats. As they emerged from a particularly narrow passage, they came face to face with a man unlike any they had seen before. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features and a hardened expression. He wore a long black coat adorned with silver buckles and carried a silver-tipped cane. Despite his imposing appearance, there was something about him that seemed almost otherworldly. "My name is Harlan," he said, his deep voice echoing through the cavernous halls. "I've been searching for you." Jamie's heart sank as he realized this was no ordinary man. This was a hunter, a man employed by the owners of the mansion to eliminate any intruders who dared to enter. "What do you want from us?" Elena demanded, her voice shaking with fear. Harlan flashed a wolfish grin. "Oh, nothing. Just your lives." A sense of absolute dread settled over the group as Harlan advanced, his cane tapping against the stone floor. They knew they were no match for him, weakened as they were from their injuries. Suddenly, Lilith stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination. "I know you," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You're the one who killed my sister." Harlan's expression faltered for a moment, then hardened again. "That may be," he said, "but I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to do a job." With that, he lunged forward, aiming his cane at Jamie's heart. But before he could strike, a deafening roar filled the air. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith turned in amazement to see a massive black stallion charging at them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Harlan backed away, his eyes wide with fear. As the horse approached, it seemed to morph into something else entirely, a shimmering black shape that enveloped the group in a protective embrace. They felt a rush of energy course through their bodies, and suddenly they were filled with a newfound strength. Harlan backed away, his expression one of defeat. "I'll be back," he promised. "I always get my prey in the end." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. The group stood in silence for several moments, their hearts still racing from the encounter. Finally, Jamie spoke. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling with awe. Lilith smiled wryly. "That," she said, "was a friend." Chapter 12. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith stumbled out of the room, shaken from their encounter with the shape of darkness. Lilith led them down a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever, the walls gleaming with a sickly green light. They heard whispers, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Each step they took felt like they were sinking further into the mansion's clutches. Eventually, they came to a large room with a long table at the center. The walls were adorned with grotesque paintings of demons and other unspeakable creatures. At the head of the table sat a figure with a black cloak, their face hidden in shadows. "Welcome," the figure said, their voice echoing through the room. "I have been waiting for you." Jamie, Elena, and Lilith exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do next. "Who are you? What do you want?" Jamie asked, his voice trembling. "I am the master of this house," the figure replied. "I am the darkness that haunts these halls, and I want your souls." The room began to spin, and Jamie felt as if he were falling into an endless void. He heard screams, but couldn't tell if they were coming from him or someone else. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder, and the darkness began to lift. It was Lilith. She pulled him to his feet and gestured for Elena to follow. Together they ran back down the corridor, away from the table and the figure in the black cloak. They stumbled out of the mansion and into the dark woods, gasping for breath. Jamie looked back at the mansion, feeling a mix of terror and sadness. "What now?" he asked, turning to Lilith and Elena. "We keep running," Lilith replied, "until we find a way out of this nightmare." Jamie knew there was no other option. He took one last look at the mansion, and then they ran into the darkness, hoping to escape the power of darkness that followed them everywhere. Chapter 13. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith ran blindly through the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had managed to escape the figure in the black cloak, but they knew they were still trapped in the mansion, and they had no idea how to get out. As they stumbled through the maze-like hallways, they could hear the sound of their own breathing and the rustle of their clothing. They couldn't even see the hands in front of their faces, let alone the way they had come. Suddenly, they heard a low growl, and then another. They froze, their hearts racing. As they realized they were being followed, Jamie turned to face the sound, but there was nothing there. Then a pair of glowing eyes appeared out of the darkness, followed by another set, and another. They were surrounded by a pack of wild dogs, their eyes fixed on the three travelers, their teeth bared. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith backed away slowly, trying to keep the dogs at bay. But then they heard another sound, a moaning, pitiful noise that seemed to be coming from the darkness ahead. Against their better judgment, they followed the sound, hoping to find someone who could help them. As they drew closer, the moaning grew louder until they were in a dimly lit room and they saw the source of the noise. Before them lay a woman, her skin pale and her eyes blank. She was being held down by several twisted, devilish creatures who were tearing at her flesh with their nails. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith backed away slowly, their eyes fixed on the horrific sight. Suddenly they heard a voice, a deep, rumbling voice that seemed to be coming from all around them. "Leave now," the voice intoned, "or suffer the same fate as this poor creature." Jamie, Elena, and Lilith didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to escape the horror that surrounded them. But they weren't fast enough. As they ran through the darkness, they could hear the sound of breathing behind them, the sound of footfalls getting ever closer. Just as they thought they would be overtaken, they burst through a door and into the light. They were outside and in the fresh air, and they fell to their knees, grateful to be alive. But they knew they weren't safe yet. They knew that the power of darkness was still alive, and they were still in its thrall. Chapter 14. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith stumbled out of the mansion and gasped for fresh air. But they dared not stop running, knowing they were not yet safe. After a while, they slowed down, trying to catch their breath, and that's when they heard it. A howling noise that made their skin crawl. They looked at each other in horror, knowing that the wild dogs and the man in the black cloak were still after them. They continued running as fast as they could, but the darkness seemed to swallow them up, and they were disoriented. They could see nothing but shadows and the occasional flash of moonlight through the trees. It was then that they heard a blood-curdling scream. It was Lilith. They ran towards the sound and found her lying on the ground, clutching her leg, which was bleeding profusely. Jamie and Elena tried to help her up, but she was paralyzed with fear and pain. They knew they couldn't leave her behind, so they lifted her up and continued running, supporting her weight between them. They could still hear the howling and barking coming closer, and they knew they were running out of time. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a pack of wild dogs. They bared their teeth and snarled, ready to attack. Elena, Jamie, and Lilith huddled together, trying to protect each other. Suddenly, the darkness seemed to come alive, swirling around them like a cloak. It was the shape of the darkness that they encountered before. It spoke to them in a deep, rumbling voice that shook the ground beneath them. "You cannot outrun me, for I am the power of darkness. Give me your souls, and I will spare your lives." Jamie, Elena, and Lilith held hands tightly, trying to draw strength from each other. They knew that giving in to the darkness was not an option. They closed their eyes and prayed for a miracle. Suddenly, they felt a warm sensation engulfing them, and the darkness retreated. They opened their eyes to find a glowing figure standing in front of them. It was the woman in white who had led Jamie to the dark room earlier. "Do not be afraid," she said, her voice soothing and gentle. "I am here to protect you. Follow me, and I will lead you out of the darkness." Jamie, Elena, and Lilith grabbed each other's hands tightly and followed the woman in white. They emerged from the darkness and found themselves standing outside the mansion, surrounded by the light of the rising sun. They collapsed onto the ground, sobbing with relief. They knew they had escaped a fate worse than death, but they also knew that the power of darkness was still out there, waiting for its next victims. Chapter 15. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith stumbled out of the darkness, gasping for air, hoping that they were safe. The glowing woman in white had led them out of the mansion, but they weren't sure where they were. They looked around and saw that they were in a forest, but it was different from the one they knew. The trees were twisted, the branches reaching out like claws, and the leaves were black. The sky was gray, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. "What is this place?" Lilith asked, looking around. "I don't know," Elena said, her voice shaking. "But I don't think we're out of danger yet." As if on cue, they heard the howl of the wild dogs in the distance. They turned to run, but the glowing woman in white stopped them. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must go back." "What?" Jamie asked, confused. "You must go back," the woman repeated. "To the other side." "The other side?" Elena asked, her heart pounding. "Yes," the woman said. "You are not meant to be here. You must go back before it's too late. Too late for what? Lilith asked, her eyes wide. The woman didn't answer, but instead pointed to a path that led into the darkness. Follow that path, she said, and you will find your way back. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith didn't hesitate. They ran down the path, the howling of the dogs growing louder and louder. They ran until they saw a glimmer of light in the distance, and they knew they were on the right track. As they got closer, the light grew brighter, and they realized that they were back at the mansion. But it was different. The darkness that had consumed it before was gone, replaced by a warm, welcoming light. They hurried inside, and as soon as they stepped through the door, they knew they were safe. The air was clear, the sounds were familiar, and they could feel the presence of the glowing woman in white still with them. But they also knew that they were still in danger. The power of darkness was still there, waiting for them to let their guard down. They had to stay alert, stay together, and never forget that they were not alone. Chapter 16. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith were back at the mansion, but their relief was short-lived. They knew they were still in danger and that the power of darkness was still lurking around every corner. They cautiously made their way back inside, each step heavy with apprehension. As they walked deeper into the mansion, the sound of an eerie melody drifted towards them. It was faint at first, but grew louder with each step. Jamie recognized it as the same melody he had heard on the night he arrived. His heart raced as he realized that they were getting closer to the source of the power of darkness. They turned a corner and saw the source of the music, a grand piano with its keys being played by an unseen force. The room was illuminated only by the light of the moon, making the shadows dance around them. Suddenly, the music stopped. A cold breeze brushed against their skin, and a voice whispered in their ears, "Welcome back, Jamie." Jamie's blood ran cold. It was the same voice that had warned them to leave before. He turned around, but there was no one there. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The voice laughed. "I am the power of darkness, and you, my dear Jamie, have been chosen to be my vessel." Jamie felt a cold hand wrap around his neck, tightening its grip. He struggled to breathe, his vision fading. Elena and Lilith tried to pull the invisible force away, but it was too strong. Just when Jamie thought it was over, he felt a warmth spread through his body. The force that was choking him retreated, and the darkness dissipated. A figure appeared in front of them, the glowing woman in white. "I will not allow you to take him," she said, her voice echoing through the room. The darkness hissed and retreated, leaving them alone. But they knew that it wouldn't be long before it returned. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith exchanged a glance, understanding that they had to find a way to defeat the power of darkness once and for all. The battle had just begun. Chapter 17. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith huddled together, panting and sweating, trying to catch their breaths. They had just narrowly escaped the clutches of the power of darkness yet again. The glowing woman in white had led them away, and they found themselves back in the twisted forest. Jamie looked around, trying to find some semblance of direction. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their limbs reaching out like gnarled claws. The ground was dark, and the dirt black as coal, and the air was thick with an acrid smell. Elena's hand was warm in his, and Jamie held on tight as they began to walk. They didn't speak, and Lilith followed close behind them. They were all too afraid to make a sound, afraid that the power of darkness would hear them. As they walked, the forest seemed to grow darker. The trees loomed taller, and the sky above them was a deep and foreboding shade of gray. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shook, and a loud rumbling sound filled the air. Jamie stumbled and fell, landing hard on the dirt. Elena and Lilith rushed to his side, helping him up. They looked around, trying to see what had caused the disturbance. Out of nowhere, a huge creature emerged from the trees. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. Its skin was black and oily, and its eyes burned with an orange glow. Its body was massive, easily 10 feet tall, and its long claws glinted in the dim light. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith turned to run, but the beast was too fast. It caught up to them in seconds, its hot breath on their backs. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. But then, something incredible happened. The glowing woman in white appeared before them, standing between them and the beast. She raised her arms, and a bright white light radiated from her fingertips. The beast roared and backed away, its eyes burning with anger. But it was no match for the glowing woman's power. She banished it back into the darkness, and it disappeared without a trace. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith let out a collective sigh of relief. They were safe for now, but they knew that they were still deep in the heart of the power of darkness, and there were many more dangers to come. Chapter 18. Jamie, Elena, and Lilith were exhausted and terrified after their encounter with the creature in the forest. They stumbled through the twisted trees, unsure of where they were headed, but knowing they had to keep moving. The glowing woman in white walked ahead of them, her serene presence offering some comfort in the darkness. As they walked, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept turning to look behind them, but there was nothing there. Only the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig broke the silence. Finally, they emerged from the forest and found themselves in a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and its walls covered in moss and vines. The glowing woman in white beckoned them forward, and they followed her to the cabin's entrance. Jamie hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. He had a feeling that whatever was inside that cabin was not meant to be seen by human eyes. But he knew they didn't have a choice. They had to face whatever lay beyond that door if they were going to defeat the darkness. With a deep breath, Jamie pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was even more decrepit than the exterior. The walls were covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and debris. But the most unsettling thing about the cabin was the smell. It was a sickly, sweet odor, like rotting fruit mixed with something much more sinister. Jamie felt bile rise in his throat as he took a step forward. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. He froze, terrified that something was about to attack him. But when he looked down, he saw that he had stepped on a loose board. He knelt down and lifted it up, revealing a dark pit beneath. Jamie recoiled in horror as he realized what was inside the pit. Bones. Human bones, piled up in a sickening display of death and decay. At the bottom of the pit, he saw something move. Something alive. Jamie tried to back away, but he stumbled and fell. As he hit the ground, he felt something grab onto his ankle. He looked down and saw a hand, gray and gnarled, reaching up from the pit. He screamed as a hand pulled him towards the pit, dragging him closer and closer to the darkness. Elena and Lilith rushed forward, grabbing onto Jamie and pulling him back. But as they struggled to free him from the grip of the pit, they heard a voice. The voices spoke not with words, but with a feeling of sorrow and rage. The power of darkness had found them, and it wasn't going to let them go. Chapter 19. Jamie's heart pounded in his chest as he swung a rusty pipe at the shadowy figure that lunged at him. Elena and Lilith were fighting off their own attackers, but Jamie found himself struggling to keep up with the fast, distorted movements of his enemy. Suddenly, the shadowy figure dissipates into the air, leaving Jamie bewildered. In his place stood a young, scared-looking woman, her eyes wide in terror. The woman looked at Jamie and begged for his help. "Please, you have to help me," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been trapped here by the power of darkness for so long." Jamie was stunned. He had never seen a shadowy figure transform into a human before. He looked at Elena and Lilith and saw the same shock on their faces. "What do you mean? How did you get here?" Jamie asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "My husband and I were passing through this forest when we stumbled upon this cabin," she explained. "The next thing I knew, we were being attacked by these dark creatures. My husband didn't make it, but I've been stuck here ever since." Jamie's heart went out to the woman, but he knew they couldn't stay there for long. They had to keep moving and find a way to defeat the power of darkness once and for all. "We have to go," Jamie said, trying to pull her along. The woman hesitated for a moment, looking at Jamie with pleading eyes. "Please, take me with you. I don't want to be alone anymore." Jamie knew it was a risk, but he couldn't leave her behind. He nodded, and the group set off once again, this time with an unexpected addition to their party. As they walked through the twisted forest, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. They were no longer just fighting for their own survival, but now they had someone else to protect. He knew that the power of darkness wouldn't stop until it had claimed them all. But somehow, having the woman with them gave him a glimmer of hope. The group pressed on, never knowing what horror lay just around the next bend. Chapter 20. Jamie and the group continued their journey with their newly rescued companion tagging along. They had no idea where they were headed or what awaited them, but they knew they had to keep moving forward. The woman they had saved seemed to know something about the power of darkness and was willing to share her knowledge with them. As they walked, the forest began to change. Trees grew gnarled and twisted, and the ground became muddy and difficult to traverse. The woman warned them to be careful, as this part of the forest was cursed, and anyone who entered never returned. As they pushed through the treacherous terrain, they came across a clearing with an old abandoned church. It was decrepit and overgrown with vines, but the group could sense a powerful darkness emanating from within. They cautiously approached the building, straining to listen for any sound. The woman insisted that they not go inside, but Jamie was determined to find a way to destroy the power of darkness for good. They entered the church, and the darkness was palpable. It felt like the air was thick with malevolent energy that wanted nothing more than to devour them. Suddenly, a loud screech echoed through the empty church, and the group realized they were not alone. They turned to see several shadowy figures beginning to take shape. The power of darkness had found them once again, and it was not going to let them go easily. Jamie and his group braced themselves for the upcoming fight, knowing that their lives depended on the outcome. They had to emerge victorious if they had any hope of escaping the power of darkness and making it out of this cursed forest alive. Chapter 21. As they cautiously made their way through the abandoned church, Jamie, Elena, Lilith, and the woman named Sophia, who they rescued from the forest, could feel the oppressive weight of the power of darkness pressing down on them. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and the walls were covered in a thick layer of mold and mildew. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and they could hear the sound of something slithering around in the shadows. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, they thought it was another one of the shadowy attackers, But as it drew closer, they could see that it was an old man wearing a tattered suit and tie. The man had a wild look in his eyes and was clutching a large, rusty wrench in his hand. He advanced towards Jamie and his group, muttering to himself in a low, menacing voice. Jamie stepped forward, trying to reason with the man and explain that they meant him no harm. But the man didn't seem to hear him, and he continued to advance, swinging the wrench in a wide arc. Suddenly, the man stumbled and fell to the ground, his body convulsing in a violent seizure. Sophia rushed forward and checked his pulse, but it was clear that he was already dead. As they stood there in shock, the sound of footsteps echoed through the church, and a group of shadowy figures emerged from the shadows. Jamie and his group braced themselves for another fight, but as the figures drew closer, they could see that they were not enemies, but survivors like themselves. The group introduced themselves as a band of rebels who had been fighting against the power of darkness for years. They explained that they had been forced to flee to the church after the power of darkness destroyed their base of operations. With their help, Jamie and his group might just have a fighting chance against the malevolent force that was slowly consuming the forest. But as the rebels led them deeper into the church, it became clear that the power of darkness was more powerful and insidious than they had ever imagined.